I told you I would be here. Hi, everyone. I am Jane Harmon, the not-so-new president and CEO of the Wilson Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this Wilson Forum with John Lewis Gaddis. John is a long-standing friend of the center and one of this country's preeminent historians, and we're thrilled to launch his new magisterial biography of George F. Kennan. In the September 30, 1951 New York Times is a quote from James Reston, who of course is the father of our senior scholar, Jim Reston, which says, quote, "A book by George Kennan is an event in Washington," unquote. I'd say this is equally true about a John Lewis Gaddis book about George Kennan. Today's huge turnout is really gratifying, and we have people sitting in 3 overflow rooms throughout the center. In fact, I just told John or maybe it's Christian, or both of them are rock stars to get this kind of crowd. So it is a pleasure to welcome all of you that I can see, and all of you who can see me virtually via video link and webcast. Be sure to tweet your friends, by the way, and colleagues about what's going on here. We are modern at the Wilson Center. We also have 3 high school and college student groups here, part of a renewed effort by the center to reach out to universities and high schools across the country. So welcome to all of you. Today's turnout is an indication that the Kennan name continues to resonate in Washington, with new generations and with audiences well beyond the foreign policy buffs in this town. In explaining American actions in the Cold War, usually the first texts high school and college students read are the long telegram, which Kennan composed in February 1946, and the famous X article, The Sources of Soviet Conduct, which he published in Foreign Affairs a year and a half later. In fact, at the Wilson Center, we did one of our new signature national conversations on whether we need a new national security narrative. I would personally argue yes, but at the time we published what we called the Y article, which was an article written by anonymous military aides who have since been outed in the Pentagon. Kennan's signature policy contribution was, of course, the concept of containment, which became the premise for American foreign policy in the confrontation with the Soviet Union for more than 4 decades, though not always in the way Kennan anticipated. Containment was not intended to cement the status quo between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. It was meant to be a vehicle for ending the Cold War when tanks and guns would not have done so, and actually, it achieved that end. While the basic concept has continued to figure in policy discussions on Iraq, Iran, North Korea, and other countries, as someone who lived through the Cold War era, I'd argue that we've yet to find something comparable to the containment doctrine in the post-Cold War age. Over his long career as a diplomat, historian, public intellectual, and critic of U.S. Cold War policy, Kennan emerged as one of the nation's most influential wise men. And he had a long and intimate relationship with the Wilson Center, beginning with his time as a fellow in 1974 and 5, and continuing through his ongoing support of the Center's Kennan Institute. One of the country's premier institutes for Russian studies, the Kennan Institute, was established by Kennan together with then Wilson Center Director Jim Billington, now the Librarian of Congress, and a young Princeton history professor, S. Frederick Starr. We're delighted to welcome some members of the Kennan family here today, including daughters Grace Warneke. Where's Grace? There she is. Hi, Grace. It's been a few years. And Joan Kennan, right there, and the son-in-law Kevin Delaney, right here. Now, the Kennan name explains a bit, in fact, a lot of today's turnout, but so does the name John Lewis Gaddis. We are proud to call John an alumnus of the Center, and he's been long involved with the Center as the founder and chair of the advisory board of our Cold War International History Project, which has developed into a leading research program on making available previously unpublished, significant, and policy-relevant documentation from archives around the world. On this point, as I was mentioning to John and Christian, I saw Henry Kissinger yesterday, who volunteered wonderful things about our archives and their usefulness in his recent China book and his ongoing work on Russia. Frankly, there is no other, I'm totally objective in saying that there is no other institution in this town that can match the ability of the Cold War Project, the Kennan Institute, and other center programs to bring fresh, insightful, and historical context to top foreign policy issues. Again, thank you, John, for your leadership along the way. Let me remind everyone that John Lewis Gaddis is the Robert A. Lovett Professor of History and Director of the Brady Johnson Program in Grand Strategy. It's quite an impressive name. At Yale University, where he teaches courses on Cold War history, grand strategy, biography, and historical methods. His most recent books include The Landscape of History, How Historians Map the Past, that's one. Surprise Security and the American Experience, that's two. And The Cold War, A New History, which was launched here a few years ago. I'm told that John thought his first launch made him feel like a rock star, so we are trying to live up to that standard again today. In writing this book, he had exclusive access to Kennan's personal diaries, and at one of their last meetings was even handed a copy of his dream diaries. John weaves into his narrative so many quotes from Kennan's diaries, interviews, letters, lecture notes, and publications that the man seems to jump out from the pages. John, congratulations on the publication of another wonderful read. It's great to have you back at the center, and it's wonderful to be present as we consider the long legacy of George Kennan. Thank you very much.
Jane, thank you very much for that introduction. Congratulations on your own appointment to be responsible for this place, which, as you say, is in so many ways important, not just to this town, but to the whole field of the relationship between history and policy, something I feel very strongly about. So it is a homecoming in all sorts of ways, not least the number of friends, colleagues, former colleagues, and particularly members of the Kennan family who are sitting in the front row. So very happy to be here. I decided to do a PowerPoint lecture, and I'm told it will work. And Christian, I think all I need to do is to punch the arrow button. Is that correct? Well, we'll see. Don't worry. Calm down, Christian. There really is some difficulty. After finishing a book of some 700 pages, trying to figure out what to say about it that will not turn the audience into pillars of salt, thereby diminishing book sales. I've tried to list down here all the places where you can buy the book. You have to pick and choose, and there are several possibilities in doing a talk like this. I could talk about Kennan and grand strategy because with the idea of containment, George Kennan came closer than anybody else to having foreseen at the beginning of the Cold War how the Cold War would end 4 decades later, and for setting up the United States and its allies upon the path that eventually brought about that result. This is George with the first policy planning staff in 1947. You'll notice how small it was at that point. But I could equally well talk about Kennan as containment's most severe critic, for no sooner had he convinced the Truman administration to embrace the course of containment than in some ways he began trying to reverse it, fearing that the United States itself, in the act of seeking to contain the Soviet Union, had become the more dangerous nation. And George continued to hold that view, I think, for much of the rest of his life. Here he is at one of his very many appearances before Senate committees in 1959, no doubt strongly criticizing American foreign policy. I could talk about Kennan's illustrious career as one of the first Soviet specialists in the United States Foreign Service, and how that prepared him for his role as the first director of the policy planning staff, and then as ambassador to the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, But I could equally well explain how he saw himself as having failed miserably in the last of these three roles. I think he believed he succeeded really only as a career Foreign Service officer, and I think he regarded himself as having failed in those other roles. Here you see Kennan departing an airplane at Tempelhof in 1952, just about to make the statement that would get him declared persona non grata from the Soviet Union. I could talk about Kennan's subsequent careers as a historian, an early environmentalist, a longtime anti-nuclear activist, a constant critic of American culture, but I could also talk about George's teaching, his farming, his poetry, his musicianship, and what I think should be probably one of his most lasting reputations, which is the fact that he was one of the great American writers of the 20th century. I could talk about George's extraordinary diary, which he began keeping, and I thank Joan for giving me this early version of it, which he began keeping in 1916, and which he continued to keep with gaps until 2003, excerpts of which will soon be published under the editorship of Professor Frank Castigliola of the University of Connecticut. The Kennan Diary fills thousands of pages, most of them written in longhand, a hand that did not even begin to become shaky until Kennan was in his mid-90s, reflecting a mind that stayed clear right up until the last year of his life. This is a page from George's diary in 1999. My students cannot write that clearly. I could talk about what the diary reveals of Kennan's dreams, for indeed he did keep a dream diary. He carefully recorded dreams, along with the contradictions that they revealed about those within himself. He was, among the contradictions, the many contradictions, he was an insider who always felt himself to be on the outside. He was a patriot who loved his country but understood another country, Russia, much better than he did his own. He was an expert who saw his expertise as more often dismissed than drawn upon. He was an advisor who saw his advice taken when it was most casually given. He was an alarmist about the Soviet Union who became an apologist for the Soviet Union. He was an enthusiast for covert operations who came to want to abolish covert operations altogether. He was a prophet who wound up being profoundly depressed by his own vindication. He was a faithful Christian who could not help but wonder whether Jesus had not created God rather than the other way around. He was also, while arguably the most famous grand strategist of his age, a man who would much have preferred to have gone down in history as the biographer of Anton Chekhov. So if, as F. Scott Fitzgerald once wrote, the sign of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two contradictory ideas in the mind at the same time, then Kennan's has got to be one of the greatest minds of the 20th century. Or I could talk about what it was like over some 30 years to be Kennan's authorized biographer. I figured out the other day as I was calculating up how long this took that I was Kennan's Boswell longer than Boswell was Johnson's Boswell. And even then, there were contradictions. I'm glad you're at Yale and not Princeton, George told me once. That way you're not always around and underfoot. So were I to try to talk about even half of these themes, we'd be here not just all night, but probably into next week. There would be so much to talk about. I can't talk about all of those things. I thought what I would do instead this afternoon is to talk about Kennan and his relationship to the great books, because it seems to me that an underappreciated aspect of Kennan's grand strategy is the extent to which it was based on the great literary, political, and military classics that preceded the classic he himself produced. And of course, that's the famous anonymous article on the sources of Soviet conduct in July of 1947. But this was anonymous because the policy planning staff had just been formed, and if you worked for a general marshal, you were expected to be invisible. But of course, Kennan's invisibility lasted for only about a week. Within a week, Time magazine was preparing a cover with Kennan. They never actually used it, but there it is, and that's what it would have looked like. The reason the X article did not remain anonymous was the classical references that the article contained. One was to Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. The Kremlin leaders, Kennan wrote, were finding it necessary, in Gibbon's phrase, to chastise the contumacy, the rebelliousness that their own actions at home and abroad had generated. And even more strikingly, the X article cited Thomas Mann's great novel Buddenbrooks as the basis for Kennan's famous prediction, which turned out to be right in the end, that the Soviet Union would in time destroy itself from within. Because like the Buddenbrooks family, a formidable external facade contained internal enfeeblement, and the enfeeblement, he argued in 1947, was already well advanced. So how did these citations blow Kennan's cover, to his great embarrassment? Well, I asked his longtime secretary, Dorothy Hessman, this question, and she said, oh, that's simple. Only Mr. Kennan would have cited Edward Gibbon. Of all the people in Washington, only Kennan would have cited Gibbon. So what did he get from these great texts? Well, he concluded from his reading of Gibbon and Mann that, as he put it in the X article, Soviet power, like the capitalist world of its conception, bears within it the seeds of its own decay, and the sprouting of those seeds is well advanced. Therefore, the United States could enter into, with reasonable confidence, a policy of firm containment designed to confront the Russians with unalterable counterforce at every point where they show signs of encroaching upon the interests of a peaceful and stable world. And that big idea, the idea that the Soviet Union would in time destroy itself, was arguably the greatest single grand strategic insight of the Cold War. And it's one that's vindicated with eerie precision some 4.5 decades later after Kennan put it forward. To see that far into the future is remarkable. And even more so is the fact that it's Kennan's reading of a couple of great books, both written well before anybody had ever heard of the Soviet Union, that provided the basis for this prediction. Now, I don't know when Kennan first read Thomas Mann, but I suspect it was in the late 20s, when he was still in his own 20s, stationed in Weimar, Germany, and in the Baltic states. He would have read it, of course, in the original German, a language he had studied and spoken since childhood, since he grew up in Milwaukee, a very German city. I do know, because I asked him about it, when he first read Gibbon. And it was on transatlantic airplane flights during World War II, because the planes required refueling, and because diplomats normally did not have priority on them. The trips could take days to complete. It was noisy on the planes. It was impossible to talk on planes. It was difficult even to sleep. But Kennan made something like 7 transatlantic air crossings just in a year and a half in 43, 44. The only solution was to bring along a very big book. And so it was Edward Gibbon who flew across the ocean several times with George Kennan. All of which raises the question then whether Kennan drew grand strategic insights from other classical works, and if so, what they might have been. Now, despite Kennan's reputation as a realist in his approach to international relations, I found no evidence that Kennan ever read Thucydides or any of the other ancient Greek classics with any great care, perhaps casually, but not seriously. Maybe the Greeks were too democratic for Kennan. Maybe the empire they ran was too small and too temporary for him to see the analogies to his own time. Nor did Kennan, as far as I can tell, show any interest in or try to get access to the Chinese grand strategic tradition, which has now so carefully been reconsidered by another great American grand strategist, as Jane Harman indicated, Henry Kissinger. It's true that Kennan anticipated the Sino-Soviet split as early as 1947, which is extraordinary, 2 years before Mao took power. But here he was just echoing the much greater China expertise of his great friend and policy planning staff colleague, John Peyton Davies. Clausewitz, however, Clausewitz is quite another matter. Kennan never read On War as carefully as he read The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And that may be a good thing, because as I tell the Yale Grand Strategy students, a close reading of Clausewitz's incomplete and unwieldy classic will make you go bonkers. You have to back off from that text. You can't do a close reading of it. You have to search out its major points. And Kennan was able to do this thanks to an elegant summary of Clausewitz, one of the best, prepared by the German immigrant historian Hans Rothfels. This appeared in Edward Mead Earle's influential edited collection of documents, essays rather, Makers of Modern Strategy, published in 1943, in which some of the best historians in the country considered how the classical grand strategists could prepare American grand strategists for whatever role they would play, which obviously was going to be a big one in the post-war world. And unlike many of Clausewitz's interpreters over the years, Rothfels got him basically right. And it was through reading Rothfels that Kennan got Clausewitz. And he did so at a critical moment. This was his crash reading in the summer of 1946, when it was left to Kennan and his colleagues with about 2 or 3 months' notice to devise the first curriculum in grand strategy at any American institution of higher learning, which was the National War College. Now, Kennan took from Clausewitz in his crash reading, in his design of that National War College curriculum, 3 significant concepts. The first was the familiar idea that war must be the continuation of policy by other means, that war cannot be conducted separately from or independently of political considerations. But you have to remember, this was for Americans at the time a new idea. They had preferred always to think of war as something separate from politics, as something to be pursued as vigorously as possible to the point of victory, at which point, but only at which point, the politicians would then take over. The best example was the call for unconditional surrender in World War II, an idea that Kennan thought crazy because the resulting power vacuum would only pave the way for the domination of Eurasia by the Soviet Union, a wartime ally that he was absolutely convinced was going to become a post-war adversary. But Kennan found in Clausewitz strong support for an argument that he had been making in many of his wartime dispatches, and an argument he repeated in the famous February 1946 long telegram, that the Soviet Union made no distinction between war and policy, and that if the United States was to deal realistically with the Soviet Union in the post-war era, it would have to learn to blend these things together again. So that was point 1 from Clausewitz that was very important to George. Secondly, Kennan took from Clausewitz the idea that the purpose of military operations is not to produce as much violence as possible, but only enough to make a psychological impression in the mind of an adversary, a psychological impression sufficient enough to cause the adversary to stop doing whatever it is you object to his doing. And here Clausewitz was restating the very old idea of proportionality, which can be traced back through the American founding fathers to Machiavelli, to St. Augustine, and to Sun Tzu. And this idea of proportionality resonated with Kennan, as with many others in the post-World War II period, not only because of the disproportionate effects of strategic bombing during World War II, which had horrified Kennan, but also because of the far greater violence that would now be possible in wars if they were fought with atomic weapons. So The idea of proportionality is there from Clausewitz. Third, Kennan was impressed by what Clausewitz had written about the virtues of defense over offense, that every offensive in time exhausts itself. It reaches what Clausewitz called a culminating point, a center of gravity, at which just a minimal application of force can reverse the offensive. You just have to wait patiently, like General Kutuzov during Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812, for that moment to appear. So how did all this connect with the grand strategy of containment? Well, I think Kennan's reading of Gibbon had convinced him that the Soviet Union, after World War II, had overextended itself by projecting its power, whether by territorial acquisitions or by the creation of spheres of influence in Eastern Europe, too far, that it had exceeded its own capabilities, that it was overextended. So Stalin, in Kennan's view, had followed the tradition of the overextended Romans that he read about in Gibbon, certainly of Napoleon. He followed really the example of Hitler in the conquest of much of European Russia, if not Moscow itself in 1941-42. All of these previous grand strategists, the Romans, Napoleon, Hitler, and now Stalin, had failed to answer one of the most important questions in grand strategy, which is, having got what you want, what do you do with it next? Very important. In such a situation, then, a small push from the opposition, applied at just the right moment and with carefully chosen means, can reverse the momentum. This is leverage, and it can gradually force the invader's retreat at relatively little cost to oneself. All the better if this can be done without fighting any war at all. Sun Tzu himself said the best war is the one that you never have to fight. Kennan's instrument of reversal, of course, turned out to be the Marshall Plan of 1947, which was intended precisely to produce a psychological effect in the minds of the Europeans, and Stalin as well, to convince them that the European future need not be communism under Soviet domination. The Marshall Plan in this sense was a Kutuzov-like maneuver from which Stalin, like Napoleon, never recovered. Now, of course, Clausewitz had served in the Russian army in 1812, and he even makes a cameo appearance in Tolstoy's epic novel, War and Peace, if you get as far as page 771 in the current new edition. Kennan, of course, knew Tolstoy very well, as he did the other great works of pre-revolutionary Russian literature. And it was largely through these, I think, that he had primarily educated himself as a young foreign service officer about the post-revolutionary, that is, the post-1917 Soviet Union. But just how did writers like Pushkin or Turgenev or Gogol or Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, and especially Chekhov, inform Kennan's grand strategy during the Cold War? Well, I think the way he used them was as a window into the Russian national character. He would have said, and did say, into the Russian soul. And what he saw there was that the Soviet Union, for all of its power and pretensions, was an aberration. It was temporary. It would not last. Kennan is writing this as early as 1932. It's extraordinary. And one of the best illustrations of why he thought this came, I think, in June of 1945, when George Kennan sent himself voluntarily to Siberia. Now, he had done this chiefly because of his great ancestor, the first George Kennan, shown here. This is Kennan, 1845-1924, author of the classic Siberia and the Exiled System, a major figure on the American lecture circuit in the late 19th century. This was his lecture garb. He would give the first part of the lecture in regular clothes, and then he would come out in prison garb with clanking chains. It was extraordinarily effective, for sure. And it was partly curiosity about his ancestor that caused George to want to see at least some portion of Siberia. But he passed this off to the State Department as an investigation of the new industrialization that was going on outside of Novosibirsk, and went there by train in June of 1945, 1 month after the end of the war. Here's a photograph of George somewhere in Siberia. Again, from John, I think Siberia. I think it's even written on the back, probably Siberia. It looks like Siberia. Let's assume it's Siberia. It's in the book, so it's too late. Kennan returned from Novosibirsk to Moscow by air. And that trip also took a long time. It took 3 days and several stops and a lot of improvisation along the way. And on the flight from Novosibirsk to Omsk, an illiterate old woman, a babushka, sat next to him on the plane and regaled him with observations on life, reflecting, as George wrote in his diary, all the pungency and charm of the mental world of those who had never known the printed word. Well, George loved this, and she loved George. And so when the flight landed at Omsk, he shared his lunch with her, sitting under the wing of the plane in the shade. It was a hot day. And at some point, he pulled out his copy of Tolstoy. I don't know which Tolstoy. He just says Tolstoy. And he started reading Tolstoy aloud to the babushka. And of course, she loved it. But what was more significant was that the entire passenger load of the plane gathered round to listen to George Kennan read Tolstoy to an illiterate babushka in his wonderfully classical Russian. And I think there was something magical about that moment. I think it was a turning point for him, because it suggested at what was arguably the highest point, the apex of Soviet power, right after the war had ended, that the Soviet hold on Russia and on its people was a good deal weaker than superficial appearances might have suggested. So Tolstoy, distant in the past though he was a path to the future. And then there is the first university lecture, as far as I can tell, that George Kennan ever gave. And this took place, I'm pleased to say, at this university on October the 1st, 1946. The chief target of George's lecture that day was the former Vice President of the United States, Henry A. Wallace, who had just been sacked from the cabinet of Harry S. Truman for insisting that the only choices available to the United States in its relationship in the post-war period with the Soviet Union were conciliation on the one hand, what George would have regarded as appeasement, and a new world war on the other. Wallace said in his speech, the speech that got him fired, that getting tough never achieved anything. The other side will only get more tough, and so we might as well give the Russians what they wanted. Kennan, of course, thought otherwise, and to explain why, to explain how there was a different path from the two that Wallace had laid out, Kennan devoted the last few pages of his lecture at Yale, and I think this must really have puzzled the Yaleys, to a short story by Anton Chekhov. That's the text, and the single space is the short story. And the short story is The New Villa. It's about a well-meaning owner of an estate who had tried to befriend its peasants in order to reform their lives, but had gotten nowhere with the peasants. And so she walked away sadly, but was followed by a sympathetic blacksmith. "Don't worry, don't be offended, mistress," said Rodion. "Wait a couple of years, and you can have the school, and you can have the roads, but not all at once. If you want to sow grain on that hill, you first have to clear it, and then you have to take all the stones off, and then you have to plow it up, and then you have to keep after it, and you have to keep after it. And it's just the same with people. You have to keep after them and keep after them until you win them over." And Kennan used this passage from Chekhov with the Yaleys to make an important point. People, he was suggesting, I think, could reshape even the most tyrannical governments But it could not be done overnight. It would take time. And circumstances, not Wallace-like sentimentality, would shape people. So I think therein lay the key to what the American strategy of containment should be in Kennan's mind. To create the conditions over time that would leave the leaders of the Soviet Union no choice but to reshape their country, patiently and non-provocatively, to keep after them until you won them over. And when Kennan gave this lecture in the fall of 1946, Mikhail Gorbachev was 15 years old. It would be another 39 years before Gorbachev would come to power. But Kennan saw him coming, well before Gorbachev himself saw himself coming. Kennan did this by drawing upon an image, really a metaphor, from the Russian writer he most admired, whose biographer he hoped someday to be. But why this affinity for Chekhov? Why the connection to Chekhov? This is still kind of a mystery to me. Possibly it was because of the death of George's mother 2 months after George was born in the year 1904. She died in turn 2 months before Chekhov died, also in 1904. Possibly it was Chekhov's writing. I mentioned in the preface to the book an experience my wife Toni and I had visiting George and Annalisa in Princeton in 1999, I believe. And George was interested in the fact that my wife Toni was directing the cherry orchard at Yale, and we got to talking about Chekhov. And suddenly George began talking about Chekhov's short story, The Steppe, which is about a little boy who is being sent off to school across a vast and empty landscape on a cart, on a load of hay. The cart is being pulled by oxen, driven by peasants. The trip is long. It seems unending to the little boy. The sky is huge overhead. The stars are relentlessly cold at night. And as George told this story about this lonely little boy, not knowing where he was going or why, the tears came down his cheeks. This was 1999. There's bound to be some kind of connection here. This is George at roughly this age. Maybe it was Chekhov's self-control. It's no stretch to suggest that the idea of containment had something to do with self-control, in Kennan's mind at least, that it had something to do with Chekhov's ability in his plays and in his stories to say a lot with a little. It's what actors and directors call subtext. Perhaps it was the experience of buying a farm just outside the curiously named village of East Berlin, Pennsylvania, immediately after returning from internment in Nazi Germany. It had been East Berlin, of course, long before the other place was East Berlin, and it is still East Berlin long after the other place has ceased to be East Berlin, so it has a greater claim, I think, to historical roots. They bought a farm just after George had returned from internment in Nazi Germany in 1942. And the great rambling house with a few cherry trees on the property then, although Christopher tells me there are no cherry trees on the property now. John, I'm not sure. Are there some? Reminded George and Annalisa of Chekhov's greatest and last play. And so at least in the correspondence then, maybe not later, Christopher doesn't remember this, but it's in the correspondence to George's sister, Jeanette. Annalisa says, we bought it because it reminded us of the house in the cherry orchard. And so I've taken a little bit of poetic license in this book to stretch that point a little bit, but I think there really was a connection. I like to think that the Chekhov connection went further than that. I like to think that the Chekhov connection had something to do as well with another house about halfway around the world called Yalta, which was the last house in which Chekhov lived. This is the White Dacha, completed in 1898. This is a contemporary postcard, so it looked something like this when Chekhov lived there. But he knew, even then, because he was a doctor, that he was dying of tuberculosis. Nevertheless, he used a great deal of his time to plant the garden that you see just beginning to take root in this photograph, knowing that he would never see it in full bloom. Here's another view taken in March 1904. It's about 3 months before Chekhov died. It's kind of fuzzy, but you see the plants being staked up. You see how high they are, not very high. You see in the foreground, very curiously, a crane. This was Chekhov's crane. It was actually a wild bird that had adopted Chekhov, thought that he was a pleasant individual, and so in the appropriate season would fly in and visit Chekhov and then fly off again to parts unknown. But it kept coming back. It was very fond of Chekhov. Chekhov was very fond of it. Kennan was only a month old when this photograph was taken, but he was able to visit the house and the garden some 33 years later in 1937 while he was stationed in Moscow. I've not found any photographs of that visit, but I know he was there, and we can assume that the plants had grown. I know he was back again at some point, I think in the 1970s. But my wife Tony and I were there last summer, and this is what the place looks like now, which is no doubt what Chekhov intended it to look like over 100 years ago. And what does all of this have to do with Kennan's 1946 talk at Yale, or with the larger grand strategy of containment? Why would somebody talk about grand strategy and gardening in the same talk anyway? Well, let me read to you something that George wrote a few years later, and he repeated this idea on multiple occasions. Quote, "We must be gardeners and not mechanics in our approach to world affairs. International life was an organic process," Kennan added. It was not a static system. Americans had inherited it. They had not designed it. Their preferred standards of behavior, therefore, could hardly govern it. But it should be possible, quote, "to take these forces for what they are and to induce them to work with us and for us by influencing the environmental stimuli to which they are subjected. This would have to be done gently and patiently and with understanding and with sympathy, not trying to force growth by mechanical means, not tearing the plants up by the roots when they fail to behave as we would wish them to. The forces of nature will generally be on the side of him who understands them best and respects them most scrupulously." So more than anybody else, it was George Kennan who showed in the mid-1940s that one need not resort to either war or appeasement in dealing with the challenge posed by the Soviet Union, that with patience, there could be a third way. Now, Kennan would have been the first to admit that he himself was not always patient, that he did not always or even often practice what he preached, hence his multiple contradictions, which so often exasperated his contemporaries, even as they have fascinated his biographer, and I hope the readers of the biography. Still, on the whole, Kennan was right. He lived to see the seeds he planted in the 1940s, however precariously, vindicate him. Chekhov, of course, was not as fortunate. He did not live to see the plants, the seeds that he planted at Yalta, grow into what they are today, over 100 years ago, this great garden, which you can see when you go there now. But I like to think that one or two of the seeds that Chekhov planted a long time ago took root in the mind of Chekhov's failed biographer, George Kennan, with the result that the two of them collaborated with surprising success in the saving of Western civilization. Thank you. Questions?
Please. I think you can answer them from
Okay,
what you'd like to
sure.
say. Thank you, John. We have a good 45 minutes for questions and comments. The floor is open. If you could please wait for the microphone. The microphone's on both sides of the room, and state your name and affiliation if you'd like. Okay, we'll start up there.
Dave Rogers, independent historian and Woodrow Wilson Center hanger-on. One of the more unfortunate aspects of George Kennan's character was his lifelong racism. Would you please explain why, if there is a rational explanation, why he, for his animus not only against people of color, but also non-Nordic white people?
Well, first of all, I would dispute the nature of the question and the way it was phrased. I don't think that he was a lifelong racist. I know he wasn't. What I do know is that he was the product of his times, and that anyone who grew up in the time that he grew up, which was very much a WASP, Midwestern culture, would have had certain views and would have expressed them in ways that today would not seem politically correct. And so one can find plenty of examples of this in his references to women and to minorities and certainly to Jews as well. But I think one has to put these things in context. One cannot really responsibly, as a historian, pull these things out of the past and put them on exhibit as if they were zoological specimens today, in today's context. One has to make the effort to ask what was normal then, and then how has the culture changed now? So I think that's the first approach to that question, and I would put George Kennan in that context. It is true that in his memoir, published in 1967, there were things that he said about the Jews that he turned away from the legation in Prague in March of 1939 that came across harshly. But of course, he had no option other than to turn them away. I think he would have acknowledged, in retrospect, he could have phrased that passage in his memoir perhaps more gracefully and with greater sympathy. But in fact, if you look at what he actually did, this he doesn't talk about in the memoir, but I talk about it in the book, he was helping to get Jews out, children, other Jews as well. He was working on this very quietly in Czechoslovakia and also in Berlin. Now, when you say with regard to the Third World, was he fond of the Third World? No, he was not fond of the Third World. But this was partly because he had no training to deal with the Third World. And when obliged to visit it, he often reacted negatively to what he saw. I'm sure he's not alone in this. He was not one of these people who, the old Coca-Cola song, "We Are the World." And that was not George Kennan, not in that sense. His expertise lay in the Northern Hemisphere. His expertise lay particularly with Russia. His knowledge was deeply affected by Scandinavia, of course, by marriage to Annalisa and the time that they would spend there every summer. So, of course, that became, in some ways, a standard for him. But to say that he was a racist, or to conclude that he was a racist from those circumstances, I think is going too far. I think one has to simply ask, are there other people of his period and time who would have expressed themselves similarly? I think there are plenty of them. So I don't know what it gets us to say that he was a racist. Nothing, I think.
Thank you. Michael Dobbs?
I'm Michael Dobbs. I'm a former Kennan Fellow and Moscow correspondent for the Washington Post.
Mm-hmm.
You probably read, you mentioned Frank Castigliola,
Mm-hmm.
and you probably read his review of your book in the New York Review of Books.
I did notice it, yes.
I'm wondering if you would care to address his critique that you're more in sympathy with the Kennan of the containment era than the later Kennan, and that you gave short shrift to some of his criticisms of U.S. foreign policy, including the war in Iraq.
Well, by the time I got to the war in Iraq, which is 2003. The book is about 765 pages long, first of all. Secondly, Kennan was adamantly opposed to the war in Iraq, but of course when it broke out, he is 99, so he is not leading the opposition to the war in Iraq in the same that he was a leader of the opposition to the war in Vietnam some decades before. There were some public statements, yes, and I had some correspondence with him for sure about this. But a biographer has to pick and choose, even in a book this big, what to address. The book could easily have been twice the size that it is, given the material that I had to work with. So I do, I believe, reference briefly his opposition to the war in Iraq. I did not give it the same space as the Vietnam situation, but that was for that reason. I did have an interesting correspondence with him at the time, which shows the acuity of his mind. And this I did not include in the book, but I'll tell you the story. I had published an article in Foreign Policy in 2002 on the Bush National Strategy Statement, which is about a year before, about 6 months before the invasion. And this was a somewhat complimentary article saying I thought there might be an interesting new grand strategy here and so on. It was a somewhat controversial article as well, as many of the articles I write tend to be. And I was saying to myself as I published this thing, well, I hope George doesn't read this one. But sure enough, George sent me rather defiantly a couple of his pronouncements on the run-up to the war in Iraq and his interview in the New Yorker and whatnot. And I thought, oh, gee, I'm going to have to send him my thing in response. So I thought I would just cover myself because I just happened to get a really superb paper from one of my students just back from China, really quite a remarkable paper. And I thought I would send that along in the hopes of distracting George's attention. But and in a way it did, but in a way he got back at me because I had a letter back from him a week later, very, very quickly, flicking my piece aside like that, saying my piece had just raised a question in his mind as to what is strategy. And that's all he said, very plain. But your student, he said, has written one of the greatest documents of our age. How could a mere undergraduate have so much more wisdom and sagacity than his professors?
Very, very good. As Jane mentioned, we have a number of people sitting in several overflow rooms around the center, and we've invited them to comment or pose some questions. So here's one from one of the overflow rooms.
Okay, sure.
What would George Kennan say about Russia's global and regional role today as a brick that is a rising country? And what role will Russia play in the new multipolar world?
Well, I'll take a slight stab at the first one, but I think I'll just dodge the second one entirely and leave this to the Kennan Institute and Blair and his colleagues. That's what you guys are here for, right, Blair? And at the same time, I'm going to slightly dodge the first question because I really don't like to be putting words in George's mouth when he is not here to say what he would have thought. So I think that's kind of cheating also as a biographer and as a historian. He would have judged each situation in its own way. I would just say this. I do not think Putin would have come as a great shock to George. I do not think that the return of an autocracy, the return of an autocracy that has closely linked itself with the revival of Russian Orthodoxy, religion, and all of this, that these things would have come as a great shock and surprise to George Kennan. I think what would have become a great shock and would have come as a great shock and surprise would have been if Russia had somehow turned into a Scandinavian democracy. But, and yeah, many Americans did have that thought, that with maybe just a little bit of help, it could do that at the end of the Cold War. But George's knowledge of Russian culture was sufficiently deep that I know that he never expected this. And I think that he would not have been surprised. It wouldn't mean that he would approve necessarily of Putin, but he would say that this is really quite characteristic of what you would expect in Russia. Let me invite Grace and Joan to add to that if there's anything you would like to add, either of you. Okay, thanks.
All right. There's a question all the way in the back in the corner. Yep.
Wayne Merry, the American Foreign Policy Council. In the mid-40s, Kennan wrote a fascinating memorandum to Averell Harriman, his boss, about the enduring nature of spirituality and religion in Russia, which, of course, at that time was under enormous Stalinist pressure. In my own years working at the embassy in Moscow in the early 80s and then even more in the early 90s, I reread that memorandum many times because it was so prescient. I have not, however...
George would be so pleased because nobody read it at the time he wrote it.
Well, hopefully Harriman did.
No, I don't think so.
Oh, dear.
But anyway, go ahead.
In his later writings, however, I have, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, I haven't found any particular discussion of this topic by Kennan. And I wonder if in your extensive conversations with him, letters, diaries, and other things, if you have can recall any particular commentary that he made after the revival of religion in post-Soviet Russia, what he saw as its manifestations, its directions, its positive and potentially its negative qualities.
Well, again, I'll call for supplemental comments here, or more authoritative comments from the Kennan family in the front row. But in my conversations with him, I don't remember that we talked specifically about this. But I do know that throughout his life, throughout his writings on Russia, maybe not the public writings all that much, but certainly the private writings, there was constant attention to the role of religion. I can remember particularly, and I think maybe I quoted in the book, a diary entry, really not about Russia per se, but it was about the Baltic states. It was either Estonia or Latvia in the 1920s. And just talking about the peasants in the churches with the tree branches on the floor and the services and the songs. Remember that George actually spent a Christmas, a very hungry Christmas in about 1928 in a monastery on the Estonian-Russian border when he was learning Russian. He almost starved, according to his account of this. This is somebody who always took the role of religion seriously, never underestimated it. And I think that that memo is one illustration of this. But the memo itself was 12,000 words long. So it was like 20 pages, when you print it out. So it's not too surprising that it really didn't have the impact of the long telegram. It made an important point, which is that Russian culture is much deeper than Marxist-Leninist ideology, and that's a tip-off for what to expect in the future. But I don't think it was a particularly clearly argued memo, and I don't think it was designed, or I don't think it was well-suited to being read in the hectic days of the war, and I think that's why it fell mostly between cracks. But it's one that George was very proud of, and it's one that he resurrected. I think it may have been the one that he actually pulled out of the files when he went back to Washington and tried to pass it around again with a little note, "This is worth reading," and eventually reprinted it in his memoir. Anything else on this? Okay.
Thank you. Maybe there's sort of a follow-up question, another hard-hitting question from our overflow audience. If Kennan had not written the containment article, would we all be here today to celebrate him? Maybe a one-hit wonder?
Probably not.
All right, let's take a couple more questions.
No, let me say a little more than that. I think that something like the strategy of containment would have emerged. The logic of the situation was such that somebody would have found a third path, and so I don't think that Kennan was unique in thinking along these lines. But I think the timing would have been different. I don't think it would have emerged as quickly. What's extraordinary is that this document took hold so quickly, and it quickly became the official policy. And I think this was because only George Kennan had the credibility to write this at that particular time and make it believable. Now, maybe 2 years later or 4 years later or something like that, somebody else could have come along. But remember, Chip Bolin could never have written anything like The Long Telegram. Chip Bolin was an extraordinary canny and bright guy, but he was not a great writer. And if you compare his own writing with that of Kennan, I do that at one point in the book, it's extraordinary. The difference great writing actually makes rhetoric and argument. And I think that was what was so amazing about The Long Telegram, was not just the way in which it was sent, but the language in which it was written. And the same was true later on of the X article as well. The same was true of Kennan's National War College lectures. So speaking and writing well is really important. And I think the idea of containment would have eventually materialized, but I think it would have taken longer for that to happen.
Good, thank you. Yafang, please wait for the microphone.
Hi, Professor Gaddis. Welcome to the Wilson Center. Thanks a lot for the book. My name is Yafang Shah. I'm a fellow at the center. Otherwise, I teach at the Long Island University in Brooklyn, New York.
We've corresponded.
Thank you. I have a comment and a short question at the very end. Okay. George Kennan and containment are not just read and discussed in the English world. He and his theory are read and discussed widely by many Chinese. My sources in China inform me that several prominent Chinese press are competing to purchase the copyright of the English version of the book in order to prepare a Chinese version. Now, some of you might know that several of Professor Gaddis' book has already been translated into Chinese, like A Long Peace and The Strategy of Containment. And also, these press are competing for the translating the new Cold War history. Yeah. So now, here come my question. Now,
I'll just say that I'm delighted to hear this, and I'm awaiting the immense royalties that will come my way.
Yes, of course. Another American diplomat who is a household name in China is Harry Kissinger. Professor Gaddis, you have written about Harry Kissinger, but we don't have a biography of Harry Kissinger of such dimension yet. Do you have a plan to produce such a book about Harry Kissinger? Thank you very much.
The short answer and the long answer at the same time is that no, I have no plans to write an equally lengthy biography of Henry Kissinger. Just think about the actuarial tables that would be involved in this, not to mention how much tougher a task it's going to be to write about Henry Kissinger, because Kissinger's involvement in government is so much longer. I'm not persuaded, maybe I'll be surprised, I'm not persuaded that Henry has kept a wrenchingly self-critical diary in the same way that you never know, but nonetheless. So no, the answer is not. There is a biography in the works, Neil Ferguson. There are several other biographies that have, of course, been done. So we will await those with interest, but I'm not going to do it.
Thank you.
Jim Hoagland, Washington Post.
Yeah. Hi.
Professor Gaddis, thank you very much for this really entrancing lecture. Your answer on the importance of the Long Telegram encourages me to ask you something of a speculative question. What is your sense, your impression really, of the presence or the absence today of grand strategy thinking in the American administration in particular? If the answer is more on the absence side, could you talk about whether or not you see it elsewhere in the world and why the absence has developed here?
Well, it's a very good question, and I think it has something to do with why Paul Kennedy and Charlie Hill and I for the last 10 years have been trying to teach grand strategy at Yale. we have done so out of a vague sense of dissatisfaction with the level of strategic thinking that exists. We got into this before 9/11, but 9/11 certainly reinforced our sense of urgency on this point. We've also discovered, and one of the reasons we continue to teach it, and one of the reasons we have actually expanded the size of the class, is that it attracts so much interest on the part of Yale students. And what this tells me is that Yale University itself is not providing something that the students consider to be very important. It provides a good liberal education. It provides highly skilled professional training, but it does not connect most of the time this liberal education to professional responsibility. And that's one of the things that we have tried to do in this class, is to set one up that in the course of a year actually tries to do that. It's actually very closely modeled on the class that Kennan set up at the National War College and that Stan Turner set up at the Naval War College in the 1970s. So we sense an absence of this, and certainly our students sense an absence of this. And I think it's probably fair to say, because the program is being imitated or emulated in one way or another in several other places around the country, I think there is also a sense out there of this problem. I am not sure that everybody agrees on exactly what the solution is. I'm not sure that Paul and Charlie and I actually agree very often on what the solution is. We teach the course together, but it doesn't mean we have the same views on this. We do have certain basic views, though, one of which is connected very closely to what I was talking about today, and that is the extraordinarily close connection that should exist between the great classics of the past. And here I mean not just the literary classics, but going all the way back to the ancient classics, Thucydides, and professional training. And it worries us that that more places don't try to establish that training. Why are the classics important? Well, it's not that everybody is going to draw the same lesson from a classical work. You give Thucydides to two students, and they will come out with very different answers to the question, what is it all about? But the fact that they have thought about what is it all about has expanded their database, so to speak. It's expanded their range of experience beyond anything that they themselves can experience. And it seems to me that really is the role of the classics, and that's the relationship to grand strategy. If you are in a position of responsibility, exposure to the great classical works is the way that you accumulate the intellectual capital, which, as Henry Kissinger famously said, you do not add to once you get into a position of responsibility. You have to work with what you've got, so it's important to get the right kind of intellectual capital. And there is a reason why the classics continue to be read over all these years. There is a reason why people have found examples in them, been moved by them, etc., and learned from them. And so simply for that reason, we think our students should be part of that same tradition. And I would like to see that kind of education, which I think once was standard, without anybody having to think about it, because so many places really did a classical education and even classical languages as a requirement. In the 18th and 19th century, it came to the founding fathers automatically, but it certainly does not come to us automatically. And so that's why we do it. I think it does help to meet a need, and I think that's really about as far as I can go. We have no way of knowing what our students will do with this training. We are beginning to see some evidence of it, but they're mostly still very young. We like to think of ourselves as kind of not so much grand strategy professors, but as grand strategy coaches. Because if you think about what a coach does, a coach trains his or her players in the rules of the game, the lore and legend of the game, the history of the game, how great games have been played, how great players have turned in epic performances, and so on and so forth. But when the game is actually being played out there, the player cannot stop and look up what the next move on the playing field is going to be in Thucydides, or You cannot call or you cannot have an earplug in your ear with the coach telling you exactly what the instantaneous next move is going to be. You have to do these things yourself. But the premise of athletics is you'll do it better from having had a good coach. And the premise of our teaching grand strategy is that you'll do it better from having studied these great classical works while you're still young, while you still have time, while you are open to them. And they will provide the intellectual capital that you can draw on later.
Thank you. Jerry Livingston, who I believe served under Kennan at one point in his career.
Yes, that's right. Both Jim Lowenstein, who's sitting next to me here, and I served with George in Belgrade when he was a master there. My question, Professor Gaddis, does not relate to Yugoslavia, but to Germany, a country which George Kennan admired a good deal, I believe. Could you say a little bit about his attitudes toward Germany, particularly about his changing attitudes toward German unification between the 1940s and after the Berlin Wall and in 1989?
Sure. This is a tangled tale. And it's really quite extraordinary because George frequently described himself as being as much a German expert as a Russian expert. He had spent as much time in Germany, he knew the language equally well, and so on. But he was really literally all over the map with regard to Germany if you look at the entire Cold War period. His first take on what should be done with Germany at the end of the war, this is January 1945, there should be a straightforward partition, just a division of Europe into two spheres of influence. That's the great letter that he writes to Chip Bolin at Yalta. But then 3 years later, after that has happened, and you would think he would be content with that, but no. George initiates a major policy study in the policy planning staff that produces Program A, which is a very ambitious program, scheme, for the reunification and neutralization of Germany that's to be negotiated with the Soviet Union, mutual withdrawal of forces on both sides, et cetera. And heroically, George does manage momentarily even to convince Dean Acheson of the logic of this, and I think briefly Nitze himself. But of course it was shot down by the Europeans themselves and by the West Germans themselves. You know, the last thing they wanted was reunification with East Germany and neutralization because they felt they had no protection. There was still, NATO was not yet really in place and so on. So there was a security problem there. So George spent the next 4 decades or so lamenting precisely the division of Germany that he had called for in 1945. So when the division of Germany ended and when the Berlin Wall came down, I thought George would be happy about this. You know, and by then I was very much in touch with him. You know, and get in touch, isn't this terrific? And no, it's extremely dangerous that the Berlin Wall has come down. And by this time, he was so concerned about the nuclear danger that anything that would rock the stability that had been achieved in Europe, he was extremely nervous about. And he's famously on record as having said, this has been quoted in multiple places, the wall came down because it was the teenagers of East Berlin lusting after the flesh pots of West Berlin. Yeah. And then when Germany actually did reunify, the Kennans were there in Berlin when that happened in 1990. But George is morose, he's upset, no good will come of this, and so on and so forth. So why did George Kennan understand Russia so well and understand Germany so poorly? It's really a puzzle, and I'm not sure I do it justice in the book. But I would say that George had a kind of a skewed view of German conditions. He really did believe, and no doubt he took this from Gibbon, that the American occupation of Germany had alienated the Germans. And he was particularly upset by, when he went there for the first time after the war, in 1949, I guess, or one of the first trips, by the PX privileges, the special privileges that the military had and whatnot, the way the Germans were treated. I said the Germans are humiliated, so they're going to hate us forever. And it was on that basis that he believed that the division of Germany could not last. But what he missed, And he wrote a great report on this in March of 1949, lamenting all of this. He didn't say a word about the East German danger, the presence of the Red Army and whatnot, and how this actually might override whatever alienation the Germans felt about PXs and cause them actually to rather like Americans. And this he missed. So there were just curious blind spots in his view on Germany that are at odds with his continuing constant shrewdness and perception in thinking about Russia. And I have no particularly good, profound, convincing explanation of this, other than just to say that he was a profoundly complicated person.
I could just add, I discussed this with him.
Hold on. Microphone. Otherwise, the folks in the overflow room and on the web are missing
I
it.
discussed this with him in the mid-1990s, and he said it was really too bad in 1945 that Germany was not divided north-south rather than east-west.
Well, there you go.
Okay. Very good. Let me take another question from the overflow room, asking you, John, to please elaborate on your observation that Kennan was a great critic of the Soviet Union who became an apologist for it.
Sure. What I meant by that was that Kennan, of course, had no sympathy for the Soviet system and saw earlier than most what that system cost Russia. And I don't think at any point did he really have sympathy for the Soviet system. He never had illusions as to the nature of that system. But there was something else that happened in the 1950s and the 1960s that profoundly affected his view of world affairs, and that was the advent of the nuclear danger. You know, he writes the cloud of danger in the late 70s, but his sense of the nuclear danger goes all the way back to 1949. And as I said earlier, what he feared was anything that would rock the boat. And that's why he feared any attempt to try to put pressure on the Soviet Union, because he was not sure what would happen. And these were his great concerns. The whole reason he wrote these 2 volumes on the Franco-Russian alliance, and there have been 3 volumes on this, was that he hoped that studying the origins of World War I could be a cautionary tale for policymakers with regard to the possibility of World War III. So this really preoccupied him. He had nightmares, I don't doubt, over this possibility. So when I say apologist for the Soviet Union, what I mean is in the period of the 1970s when détente is breaking down and when the Committee on the Present Danger, largely founded by Paul Nitze, is being created. And there are many critics of the Soviet Union publicly criticizing the Soviet Union. Later, Ronald Reagan, of course, himself. George says things that I think are apologies for the Soviet Union. At one point he said famously, Brezhnev is a man of peace. Well, yes, he was, in the sense that he didn't want a war. But this came across as an apology. There were, in the 1970s, several efforts to say that the intentions of Brezhnev and the Soviet system are peaceful. I think George underestimated Soviet ambitions in the Third World in that period, the late 1970s. But I know that he did this because, and the same thing extended into the Andropov, Chernenko period as well. I know that he did this because of his fear of the nuclear danger. And so that's what I meant by this. It was not meant to suggest that he ever approved of the Soviet system itself.
Thank you. Gentleman right there.
David Throop, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. There is another diplomat who lived into his 90s and remained intellectually engaged and was suffused with interest in Russia, wrote a study of Turgenev and wrote lots of history books and was one of the founding fathers of international relations. And that's the Englishman, Edward Hallett Carr. And his view of the Soviet Union, of course, was fundamentally different. It was much more sympathetic to Henry Wallace's. And so I would be interested to know what George Kennan thought of his English rival.
I actually don't know the answer to that question. Sometimes a biographer can spend 30 years on something and write thousands of pages and still not know the answer to the question. Kennan would certainly have been aware of Carr's great histories of the period, but Carr is mostly writing about a period later than the one that George himself wrote about. George's history stops in 1918. You see, Carr is going much beyond that point. I'm not aware that that Kennan really read. I could be wrong about this, but I'm not aware that he read. I think he would have been interested in Carr's What is History, and would have been sympathetic to much of what is in there. But on the views of the Soviet Union, and particularly the view that Carr took, if I understand Carr correctly, those are big fat volumes, that somehow what happened was destined to happen, that there was very little room for accident in what happened in the Soviet Union. Carr, I think, eventually backed down on the question of Lenin's stroke and said, well, yes, that was an accident. But otherwise, there was just this sense of, in Carr, that all of this had to be done. You can't make omelets without breaking eggs, and so on and so forth. And Kennan would not have agreed with that. Kennan would have been contemptuous of the idea that there are no accidents in history. Kennan, remember, is a great friend of Isaiah Berlin. And there were epic disagreements between E.H. Carr and Isaiah Berlin at various points. So I think his view would have been much closer to Berlin on this.
Thank you. Yep.
Patrick Healy, student at Marshall High School and reporter for the Rank and File newspaper thereof. Mr. Gaddis, your writings comprise a large part of our curriculum on the Cold War. And
I'm very, very sorry about that.
And
I apologize.
And while
it's not my fault.
and while our curriculum is both seemingly objective and pretty informational, it's also unabashedly from the American standpoint.
Of course.
And I was wondering, do you feel that's sufficient for students today?
No.
And okay. Could you elaborate on that?
Good question. All right.
What I've written on the Cold War over a very long time really goes back to the period, it goes back to a time which existed for a very long time, when you could only write from the standpoint of the United States, or at least of Western Europe. And it's only been since the end of the Soviet Union and since the early 1990s, and I might just say by way of a commercial plug, since the creation of the Cold War International History Project, that it has become possible to take a wider view and to begin to write Cold War history as international history. So that's the answer. I was born into the wrong generation for writing that kind of history.
All right.
But you should certainly forget my stuff and read the new stuff.
Right, well, let's take a couple of questions from the back.
Hi, I'm Mike Duggan. I'm the 2011-2012 Supreme Court Fellow. And a number of years ago, you wrote a very interesting article. I think it was called After Containment. I think it was in the New Republic, where you make a very interesting argument that containment would not work against a non-state entity like
Speak up, please.
Al-Qaeda, radical Islamic terrorism sort of thing. A year or two later, there's a book by a British philosopher and historian named John Gray. It's entitled Black Mass. And he says that radical Islam, like Marxism, like Puritanism, maybe like neoconservatism, that these are eschatologies, that we're evolving towards a post-historical endgame. And I was wondering, even though I guess your article says that we can't contain radical Islam, it seems like whether it's Puritanism or Islam or radical Islam, excuse me, or Marxism, if you let these things go for a while, they burn themselves out in a few generations. I was wondering if you think that maybe if we had more of a disengaged policy from the areas where Islam flourishes, maybe it would burn itself out the way Soviet Marxism did.
Well, one of the prices of having been in this business for a long time is that you tend totally to forget what you said at some previous stage in your life, particularly if you are foolish enough to write articles. And I have mostly tried to stop writing articles and commentary on current events and whatnot because I've so often been proven wrong by what then happened. So I will take at face value what you say I said in that article. But I think I would disagree with myself. Something like that, yes. Because it does seem to me that if you look at the last 10 years or so, radical Islam has been contained by something. Now, what it was is for historians to sort out. I think it has partly been American military action, which has certainly made life much more difficult for al-Qaeda, and I think that the military campaign against al-Qaeda has actually proven in both the current and the previous administration, on the whole, to have been successful. It's partly because of what those administrations did, but it's also partly because of what al-Qaeda did. Al-Qaeda did not win very many friends in the Islamic world through its own tactics, and I think we began to see those internal contradictions, which would be Kennan-esque in the sense that they were working to something self-destructing. We began to see that as al-Qaeda became active in Iraq, like 5 or 6 years ago, and you could see the Iraqi people turning against al-Qaeda. And then, of course, now with the Arab Spring, al-Qaeda has had no hand in any of that and are largely irrelevant, although just in the Syrian thing they have made a kind of feeble effort to line themselves up with the critics or with the opponents of the Assad regime. But I would say the principle of searching out contradictions within an adversary and then finding ways to magnify those contradictions, put the adversary under strain so as to magnify those contradictions, wait for the contradictions to have their effect. Try to do this with as little violence as possible, as little collateral damage as possible, is actually not a bad strategy. And I think it's not a bad summary of what George Kennan's strategy was in the late 1940s. So in that sense, I would say that there is a kind of parallel. What is ironic to me as I answer the question in that way, exploit the internal contradictions of the adversary, try to put the system under strain, wait for the contradictions to manifest themselves, but try to do that in as non-provocative a way as possible, maybe using rhetoric but not military force, actually comes very close to the Reagan administration and what it was doing with regard to the Soviet Union, it seems to me. And yet George, of course, was viscerally opposed to what the Reagan administration was doing. And that was, I'm getting a rise out of you, I can tell. That was, of course, because of the nuclear danger, and that certainly affected his view, and it trumped his view of exploiting internal contradictions. But I think the basic idea here, and this might be the take-home point that comes out of your question and the transferable point to other times and places, because we're always looking for things that classical works can teach us about totally different kinds of situations, and Kennan's is going to be considered to be a classical work for the future. And I think one of the really interesting things would be to think about how that exploitation of internal contradictions might actually be applied in situations that are far removed from anything that George imagined. And this is only fair because the original idea of exploiting internal contradictions, of course, comes from Karl Marx's writing on capitalism. So it's only fair for Kennan to appropriate Marx and use him in ways that Marx never expected, and it's then only fair maybe for me to use Kennan and extrapolate him into situations for the future, which cannot be foreseen. I hope that's not stretching things too far.
We're almost out of time here, so I'd like to call on you as the last speaker, and then we'll adjourn.
I'm Jim Lowenstein. I'm the other person other than Cherry Livingston who served with Ambassador Kennan in Yugoslavia. You said something about disagreeing with yourself. Ambassador Kennan disagreed with himself on how to treat Yugoslavia,
Yes.
on Germany, as you've pointed out, on the role of Congress in foreign policy. Do you regard the fact that he changed his mind to fit circumstances as a strength or a weakness?
That's a really good question. He certainly changed his mind a lot. I think he changed his mind too easily and too quickly on certain issues. I think he let emotions cause him to change his mind. I think he overreacted to setbacks and reacted to them too emotionally. And so that would lead him in many circumstances to change his mind. His volatility, as you know very well, both of you, on Tito's intentions. Was Tito becoming a pawn of Moscow again? Just does not look very acute or perceptive in that particular situation of 1962 and 63. So I think there was, because of Kennan's psychological makeup, his emotional fragility, I think, is not too strong a word. There was a tendency to overreact when things didn't quite go his way, and then to say we must change the strategy. Now, this is totally different from Dean Acheson. And one of the things I tried to say in the book is that the Acheson-Kennan relationship is a good deal more complicated than a lot of people believe. Acheson was actually a good deal more sympathetic to Kennan for a very long time. I mean, this finally ended with the controversy over the Reith lectures, but it certainly is not true that Acheson fired Kennan from the State Department in 1950. He asked Kennan to stay on. It was George's decision to leave. But Acheson would have said in situations like this that if things don't go your way, first of all, you keep your cool. You kind of twirl your mustache. You put on a fresh pinstriped suit. You come in and you're totally upbeat. You convey the image of being upbeat. The last thing you're going to do is to let your, as Acheson would certainly have said, to let the bastards grind you down, right? And that's an interesting lesson there about leadership, that this is often what leaders have to do to maintain morale. Now, it may not mean that they see the outcome. They may have held firm, and they may have kept up a good front, and they may have given formidable speeches and all of that, and still may not have an outcome in view. And that kind of thing, that kind of flying blind, I think would often bother George, because George would always want to have some kind of outcome in view. And so the kind of Dean Acheson thing of just being formidable and forthright, or even better, the Churchill thing in 1940 of just holding firm and saying, we will not surrender, but not knowing how you could hold firm. Just an act of faith, itself. I think that this was harder for George than it was for some of the other leaders of the Cold War. I think also the other leaders of the Cold War, Nitze, Acheson, the others, had an awareness. It gets back to plants and horticulture. And it precisely gets back to what George said you can't do, which is to tear up the plants and examine the roots. But he tried to do that very often, too often. And so that made it very difficult to work with him in a bureaucracy. It made him unpredictable. It made him appear to be volatile. That was true in Yugoslavia. It was certainly true in other situations as well. And so I think we come down really to the question of temperament. And it seems to me this is a really interesting question. George Kennan had the temperament of an artist, far more than of a policy person. And it seems to me that temperament caused him to see magnificent things that would not otherwise have been seen because of that perception, the perception of an artist and whatnot. But at the same time, an artist may not be the person that you want to, I don't know, handle your business affairs or your insurance policies or something like that. You may want somebody else to do that kind of thing, and maybe also to handle national security policy, you see. So I think that's where I come down on this question, and it's an interesting commentary on how grand strategy works, because it's often the Churchills and the Atchisons who don't know where they're going, but have the fortitude to get there, and then sometimes it's the Kennans, who sort of know where they're going, or they worry a great deal if they don't know where they're going, but the act of worrying then causes them to paralyze themselves into not being as useful as they might be within the system. I'm sorry that's convoluted, but I had a convoluted topic. I had a complex
John, thank you for this absolutely fascinating afternoon. Fascinating discussion. Let me thank all of you for coming. Also, those of you in the overflow rooms, let me invite you to a reception down on the 4th floor, a reception that's sponsored by the Kennan Institute, the Cold War Project here. And let me say I'm going to hijack John and go out the back way. I don't want him to be cornered and for the rest of the evening here in the auditorium. He'll be downstairs on the 4th floor to sign books and to answer perhaps any additional questions. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay, let me.
Oh, absolutely.
This was not.
Of course it does. Okay, let me see if I can just. I don't think I have anything to retrieve from this.
Okay, good. We'll
So
make sure it gets off of there.
Yeah, the only thing I need to do is stuff this folder.